All right, welcome to another episode of New Wine Uncorked, and we are stoked that you're joining us once again for this live episode that you can watch. If you're watching it live, you're on YouTube, so you already know about that. And then also, if you want to catch it afterwards or you want to share it with your friends, it'll be uploaded to YouTube, and then you can share that as a link. Also, it will be put on our Facebook page because we like to go across the social media platforms. And so go on over to Facebook /New Wine Skins. And then that way you can be made aware of anything that happens, such as yesterday, or maybe it was 2 days ago, on the campus of Multnomah University, we had a economic conference or seminar, a 2-hour seminar where there was presentations on the economic developments and theological engagement of the economy. And that had our director, the New Wine director, Dr. Paul Metzger, part of that and speaking on a panel. And so that also is going to be uploaded. The recording of that will be loaded onto our YouTube page. So you'll be able to catch that as well, because the hope for New Wine is to engage culture from a theological standpoint, which means for New Wine, it's we talk about building bridges, relational bridges in contemporary culture through Christ. And it's relational, and it's seeking to not only see the other, but listen to the other so that we can be with the other. Because a lot of times when we talk about engagement, it typically comes from engagement from a majority group, and it's an engagement from a very narrow perspective. It's how that group wants to engage. And then what they do is a lot of times then the groups that are engaged are then manipulated or molded into a certain brand. And we've talked about this even before we started. I was talking a little bit to Jim about his background and the Hawaiian background. We've talked about the doctrine of discovery and how the evangelical church so often has been that majority group who's engaged another people group, and an engagement is a molding. It is a transformation of the person, not how Christ came to transform humanity, but it's a transformation more of in our image as opposed to Christ's image. And we don't transform people into the image of Christ. They already have that within them. And so when we talk about engagement from New Wine's standpoint, it's relational in the sense that it has to include the other. The other is involved with that engagement. It's a cooperation. And so for many times, what this creates is this kind of a feeling of being in between. And so today, we're going to continue our talk. This is always a continuation. Dialogue is a part of New Wine. And so part of the thing that maybe you would have seen at the seminar on Wednesday was this idea of dialogue, going through the word, that we want to engage one another. But the word is not a stagnant word for Christians, because the word directly relates to Jesus Christ, who is God's word poured out for the sake of humanity. And so with that, then there's this talk for Christians about being in the world, but not of the world. So what does that look like, though? Because I'm in the world, but so often I don't know what it means not to be of the world, because I have a mortgage, I have rent, I have bills, I have a family to take care of. Just this past week, my family's been working through, my grandmother is 93. And so what are the next steps? If we were more back into the, I don't know when this stopped, and for sure for the more of the white culture, the bringing in of our elders is not much a part of the culture. Whereas I have some friends from a Mexican culture, even the Asian culture, and I would imagine too, Jim, like with the Hawaiian culture, where there's much more of that communal, where the elders come and even live. You know, we have neighbors on both sides of us here in California, where they have their parents living with them as they age. That's just not been a part of the culture I've grown up with. And so then it creates a lot of, well, what is the next step? But there's this in between, because that's part of the world. And so being in the world and not of the world, what does the Christian do? And this Sunday, I think it's God's sense of humor when he puts Halloween that falls on a Sunday. I just don't know if that really tweaks out a lot of Christians. Like, oh my gosh, I don't know if many churches encouraged costumes on Sunday morning. I don't know. I mean, our church was not like, they're all gung-ho about, hey, Saturday, come to the trunk or treat, as if that's not Halloween. We call it another name, So again, that's just goes to the chaos or confusion. What does it mean to be in the world, but not of the world? And so we're continuing with this. And I don't know what your initial thoughts are when you hear that, when Christians say, hey, we need to be in the world, but not of. What does that look like? And how does that actually like realistically play out?
Man, you bring up a really good point, because for us, Halloween, I mean, there's all these other things they say about Halloween, but it's like Halloween's Halloween, right? I mean, and it's kind of like we like participate in it because you get candy and our kids get us candy, but then we feel like, well, if we call it a harvest party, then we're not of the world, right? I mean, it's kind of like, let's separate ourselves. So instead of saying Halloween, we'll say we're having a harvest party, but bring your costumes, bring your pumpkins, and we're going to have a harvest party. And so sometimes I wonder if it's just kind of a matter of semantics, so that we feel like, it's just, let's just call it this, and then we're not of the world. But it's like, what, we're in the world, and so, yeah, I mean, that's a great question though. Great question.
Isn't there another one? Isn't there outside of harvest party? Isn't there like Jesus Ween or something like that? Is that what you guys are telling me about that?
Jesus Ween, really?
That's right. That's right.
Never heard that one.
Oh yeah, Jim. So not last week, the week before that, I brought this up. I can't remember. Yeah. So there is an actual group that instead of celebrating Halloween, it's Jesus Ween, and so you wear white. And you hand out, I believe they hand out tracts, the 4 spiritual laws and such. And so that's the way that they push against. And we were talking about that. Is that like, would that be the righteous Christian thing to do? Because it's separated, talked about sanctity, and obviously sanctification is a separation, making holy. Is that what the Bible is talking about with the sanctification? Or is that one step too far, where it's not now no longer in the world? You are clearly demarcating the difference from the world. So we were talking about that. So it's a real thing.
But I mean, it brings up a great point, is what does it mean to be in the world and not of the world, right? I mean, is it a matter of titles, or is it a matter of the heart? And so Jesus Ween.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think what you brought up there, Jim, was exactly the point though. Is it something where we just change the title of things, or just add Jesus to the title of something? Does that mean that we're not of the world when we do it that way? Or is it a matter of the heart? Is it a way that we perceive the world differently than those who are unbelievers, who are outside the people of God? Do we perceive the world? Do we love? Do we relate to other people differently? It's kind of the thing where I start, where, I look at the world differently because I'm a Christian. I allow the Holy Spirit, allow the scriptures to be the thing that guides how I look at the world. So,
yeah. And even, no.
Did you have something? Because I was going to say too, it's the way we look at the world, but also then, because again, like we go back to these key events in that, because I don't like on the small things. I think as a Christian, for me as a follower of Christ, like, because I even use the language where I'll talk about the Christians as if I'm not a Christian, because I wrestle sometimes with over labeling, because of the people in our media who tend to represent whatever Christian looks like. I kind of recoil sometimes, there's this dude who is doing a lot of work on Bonhoeffer, and he's more of a modern guy, but he associated with himself with like more of the right side of the political spectrum. And so what I found was it tainted his theology, not like, because it taints my theology too. When I get in tight with a certain group, if I don't allow other groups in. And so that's where I'm talking about, like when we talk about like this stepping into, I have so many influences, and so these different worlds, and what we hear, what we're reading, I find it problematic though, because like I'm helping out some students, you know, who are working with their doctorate degrees, even through like Multnomah and some other schools. And what I find is what we learn though is so much driven by the people pouring into us. So Phil, like you're talking how it's the way our perspective, and we had a meeting the other day, we were talking about this word, talk about words, Jim, worldview. Well, when you say a Christian worldview, some people think, oh yeah, well, that's good because we need a Christian worldview, but it's sometimes limiting, because again, what defines that Christianity? Is it the Christianity goes back to like 385 or so with Constantinople or Constantine, where Christianity was the legal religion, right? But even when it was legal and it was the primary religion, the Christians were not the ones that were leading by example, because we're so caught up in the world. So being in the world still, sometimes I think we forget though that in the world, if we're not careful, we quickly become of the world without even realizing it, because it's like that slow poison, you know, before you know, it's I used to tell my kids, it's like we're the frog in the kettle, and they'd be like, or frog in the pot, like what you use that all the time, you know, it's, well, yeah, it's this slow cooking thing. And by the time that we're roasted, we don't even know it, you know? And so I don't know how many Christians, like when we talk about this, and that's why the seminar on Wednesday was so key, is when we're talking about economic development, that hits across the spectrum, because whether you're rich or you're poor, the fact is that every day you're going to deal with some sort of financial economic status. So how do you build into that though, Phil? Because like what I'm finding is, if I'm not intentionally exposing myself to other thoughts, because, you know, when it came to like the critical race theory, like I have a pretty decent understanding of it, but wow, when I started reading a little bit more about it, I didn't realize there are people on all spectrums of the positive aspect of it, the negative aspect of it. Oh, well, how this critical race theory is different than 10 years ago when it, you know, and I'm like, so this communal aspect is what I found is like, so talking about this in between, I'm like, gosh, it really does matter what community you set yourself in.
Absolutely. I mean, excuse me, absolutely. Just like, you know, we're looking on this Zoom and there's 4 boxes here. And we've consistently talked about this throughout our YouTube streams, where we love easy answers. We love to put someone in a box, put a perspective in a box and say, these are the parameters. Knowing the moment you ask someone within that box, how do they feel about X, Y, or Z, is going to totally wreck the box. And so, and so that's the thing that we end up having to work with as Christians or as just people living in the world. Don't look for easy answers, but when we look for the relational aspect and get to actually see what people think, believe, understand, it just changes our perception, because it increases our awareness. It increases our consciousness of what people are about, and it helps us understand how God demonstrates love to people. So that changes our perspective of how we look at the world, just knowing that, yeah, man, this person that may be very crazy, may be looking for someone to be president in 3 years that was president a couple of years ago. And we're like, yo, this person's crazy. And they're like, nah, they just have a different perspective when it comes to the presidency or about culture than I do. Maybe, but but we have all these contrasting opinions. We can't put people in boxes, and we have to actually listen to see what we're actually seeing. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's key. The active listening part. We tend to, and this is what the Bible says too. Like I mean, it's cheesy, but we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, right? Like we're supposed to listen more than we speak. And that is the key part of relationality. Building a community is sitting with people and listening to them, seeing them for who they are and where they're at. And I think also part of our problem with Christianity is we're too used to defending God. We feel like we get automatically defensive. We don't want to sit and listen to these perspectives or opinions or thoughts that might differ from ours in certain ways, because we feel like, well, that's not the truth. That's not right. And instead of just listening and sitting and being with that person in a loving manner, and accepting them for who they are and where they're at, there's more that can come from that than just jumping on. Like, God does not need our defense. He is he is. And if we believe that, if we trust that in who he says he is, then we don't need to defend him. We can just sit with people where they're at and probably gain more from that than jumping to God's defense.
Which is, it brings up the interesting point too of we don't need to defend God, and yet what Paul tells Timothy is always be ready to give an answer, a reason for your hope. And a lot of Christian universities will use that as apologetics, and then the apologetics becomes much more like what you're talking about, Kayla, is this aggressive defense. And Dr. Metzger talks about all the time evidence demanding a verdict. Here's a verdict demanding evidence. How like the evangelical church talks about like, oh, there's all this evidence and then it demands a verdict for us, but the verdict's already been given, is what Dr. Metzger talks about, that Jesus's verdict. And I think this is what tweaks out so many people of faith, is that Jesus's verdict is that you're good. Like he looks at us and he goes, you're good. And yet when you look around social media, you see all this shit that's like filtering through the humanity, and you go, is Jesus like smoking crack? Because like the world that he's looking at is not the same world that I'm looking at. Cause I'm like, these people around me, like I went in yesterday to, like of all places, you would think like a Nugget or a Trader Joe's with these kind of like organic-y kind of stuff, that the people would be a bit more organic, and that like this idea of loving the other, and again, these are all assumptions and projections from Matt Farlow onto all these people at Trader Joe's. But it just surprises me when you go in, and it's a very community driven kind of store, if anyone's been around Trader Joe's. And it's so shocking to me for some reason when I see people aggressively not wearing their mask. And when I say aggressive, you can see folks who were like, if you get to a store and you just forget or something, you're like, oh my gosh, and you have to get in, run in, and you don't have a mask. Even still carry a mask, but it's interesting when I see people aggressively going against what the store is asking. And so that's where like, and especially too, when I see people who I know say that they're Christian because I've seen them at church, I've talked to them, the town that we live in is not so huge to where you could see people on Sunday and then also see them on Wednesday and stuff. And then you're like, Sunday you were different because in church you had your mask, all that kind of thing. And so this is where this idea of the influence again in the community that we're coming into, because then if I get around people who are pro other, meaning, hey, we're trying to intentionally not just see the other, but how is it that we can embrace one another and be embraced by them? And that's where I think that the ways of Jesus, sometimes when he says that other in front of me is good, and I'm looking at them and they're just being a jackmo, they have no mask and they're being mean to the checker, and I'm like, I just want to hit you. And yet Jesus is just sitting there going, that person needs to be hugged, man. They need to be loved. And I'm like, not from me. I don't have it in me, right? Like, because sometimes I'm just like, and yet that's the thing. I know, because I know I'm that person to other people. I know I'm the person in front of Jim half the time in Starbucks fumbling and going, oh my gosh, what am I doing? And I could just see. So how is it though that we get, the weird thing is we have to somewhat distance ourselves from ourselves so that my ego and all my self thoughts kind of get drained out, so that it doesn't matter what the world thinks of me when I'm turning to this person or embracing them, even though because a lot of times I'm mean to someone. This is just a testimony time, right? A lot of times I'm mean to people sometimes because I feel like they need to learn. Like if I'm not mean to them, or if I'm not a little off, like a little aggressive, then they're not going to know that they're being a jackmo, and yet if what the Bible says is true, I don't have to convict anyone from sin, because guess what? That's what the Holy Spirit does. So how do I, like, what are some of the things that you find, like for me, when we talked about this community, learning to listen in the community of people who I trust so as to hear how they engage the world, because so often when I seek to engage the world and I'm just left on my own, trying to do it Matt's ways, that's when the anger and the frustration until I'm with other folks who I hear them and how they engage in their hearts. And I'm like, dude, how do you do that? And just learning from other people, to me, seems like one of the most liberating and freeing things, and yet almost the most anti-American, to learn and to embrace others' ways so as to be free. It's like, that's where they're like, whoa, no. How do we continue to press into that though, and not be, obnoxious and aggressive like so many others in our around, especially when faith and religion come into it?
Yeah, one of the one of the things I think is really important when we think of that is humility. Putting humility at the center of it, knowing that it's not, Matt, it's not your responsibility to teach the person that they're being an a-hole at the time. That's never your responsibility unless it is. But but the Holy Spirit's to do that. And understanding that any day of the week, we're that a-hole instead of the other person that needs to be taught. So understanding that, and we look at the world, all the same things, where anyone that we look at, we think that we're greater than them in some form or fashion, that change a couple of things about your life and you're them. Where the thing where you look at someone else's life and you think, well, I'll never ever be like that. Change 2 or 3 things about your life and that's your reality in a second. And so that kind of thing. There was one more point I had to that, humility, and there's one other one, but I can't remember it. So I'm just gonna.
I like humility though.
Yeah,
humility is a hard thing though.
Jump in.
Yeah, I mean, some of the things you're describing about the world, being in the world or being in our community and seeing people reacting or acting like this. I mean, the reality is it's happening in the church. I mean, it's, and like you talked about the guy that's, doing the work with Bonhoeffer, but has more of a, the leaning, a more conservative leaning. And I just think that the world is coming into the church. I mean, that's the challenge. My daughter has, so my daughter's using the term deconstruction, right? And so, for me, it kind of like, it rears its head up, ever so often. And I'm telling my daughter, I'm like, because I just kind of see it as this ongoing, but it's like, okay, stop already. We've already deconstructed. And so for me, I'm kind of like, you know what, just stop it already. This, we've been deconstructing for 10 years. Let's start rebuilding. But as I'm talking to her, what she is deconstructing right now is Christian nationalism. I mean, she is deconstructing what's come in politically into the church, right? I mean, so then when you have people say, Jesus Christ died for our freedom, it's like, dude, no, he did not. It's like, and so for her, I mean, like we use terms like evangelicalism. I mean, that's a political term. I mean, we have to qualify ourselves. And I even remember a few years back where I was at a Wild Goose West, conference and sitting by somebody. And I remember them saying, and it's more progressive, but I remember somebody saying, oh yeah, I'm a recuperating, evangelical. I'm like, really? I mean, I am. And so, but it's just interesting because there's certain terms that have been kidnapped or hijacked. And so how do, like, even when you say the term Christian, I mean, how do we, are we to maybe reclaim those terms? Let people know that evangelicalism is not, being a Republican. I mean, it's those kind of things. And so, so that's her deconstruction. And so, we're like into these discussions now of her trying to deconstruct this kind of Christian nationalism. And so, and I think it's harder to have conversations sometimes. I mean, it's sad enough, I think. I think there are some churches where you can do this, but sad enough, you have to almost go outside of the church because it's so homogenized. People are so, if you talk about, multi-ethnicity, racism, people get upset. And I don't know what it is about why people take it so personally. What they do is they leave instead of engaging the conversation. They leave, and what do they find? They find another church that believes in what they do. And so that's when I look at the church, even Corinthians, they talk about love. We always get back to love. We use that in wedding. People like to use it in weddings, but the church in Corinth, they had problems. They had some big issues, and really Paul's kind of coming in and like when he's, I was reading, somebody says, like when he says, do not envy, if you take away the do not part, that really kind of identifies what's going on in the Corinthian church is envy, boastfulness, and all this stuff. And we look at our church today. And so, I think it's just that idea that we just, the defending, the arguing and all that, instead of engaging people with love, instead of engaging, and and so what does that look like? Because even Paul says, okay, I told you what the gifts of the Spirit are. I told you, but you know what? Here's the cool thing. Here's what's most important of all. And then he goes into this discussion of love. And so, yeah. I mean, so, when you talk about, being in the world, but not of the world, it's kind of like, well, the world is in the church, right? And so I think when Christians treat other people like that, that's how they're treating one another. And so unless the church can learn to love one another, love each other, and not be a church where we can share, well, to the triune God. I mean, we share that,
Yeah.
Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's a relational piece. Jesus Christ died for us, demonstrating his love, right? I mean, if we can just say, okay, let's just start from there and let's have a discussion and let's just stay in the discussion. That's, I think, what's key. But we want to align ourselves with people that, oh, hey, we're maskers, right? I mean, it's nuts how we try to identify, or the people we gravitate to, or even what a church is known for. Oh yeah, we're the church of the anti-mask, we're the church of the masks, we're the church. I mean, it's like, wait a minute.
With the masking and even the vaccination, I was asking someone, like, because if Jesus were here, which he is, this is supposed to be the church. We talk about this, the church always calls the Christians the hands and feet of God kind of thing. And so what would Jesus do? Would he vaccinate or not? And I was talking to a group and it came up, well, but Jesus would pray and he wouldn't need to. He's the Son of God and all this stuff. And I'm like, yeah, but then why does he get baptized? Like, why was he baptized? What was the point of being baptized? Because he's not getting baptized for the covering of his sin, right? He's not getting baptized as a public proclamation. I mean, the public proclamation for him was the fact that he just walked around. People knew that they were drawn. So there could be. So maybe the baptism is public proclamation. Maybe it has something to do with sin. The point is he's showing us something, right? He's exemplifying something. And I go back to that constantly when I hear people from the church talking about anti-vaccination, anti-mask, and I'm like, but would that be the Jesus response? Would the Jesus response be anti? Because what you're saying then is, because usually with the vaccination, I'm hearing it's not researched, it's not not enough years and all this kind of thing. And yet they're willing to put so many other chemicals in their body without them being fully researched. Okay. We're willing to get in the car, which is one of the most dangerous places for the human to be, right? We're willing to eat sugar, like a ton of sugar, which is one of the, in overconsumption is dangerous for our heart and for our body. But when Jesus is brought into the mix, I'm like, I just don't know. Did not Jesus, the Son of God, equip the human with brains to create things, to create vaccinations, to create, we splint broken bones now. Well, that's because our brains have told us, and we've evolved from, two sticks in a string of leaves tied around our leg because it's crooked, right? Now we actually have, my sister is, she probably considers herself an extreme athlete, which at her age, when we hit 40s and she runs every day, she is an extreme athlete. She really is, right? But because of that extremeness, she has gone through injuries. And so we have a crap ton of these braces and ankle things and foot stuff. Well, that's the evolution of the mind, of the way in which we think about, medical things. She's not anti any of that stuff. And most of us are not anti any of those. We go to the dentist for what, because we are not anti straight teeth and clean teeth, I guess, like these kind of things. And so I just wonder, when we talk about, again, in the world, but not of the world, how often though, when we're in the world, is our inness minus Christ immanence? When we talk about theological things, immanence and transcendence, the immanence is the immediateness, the presence, the right here and now of Jesus. Well, according to the Bible, he is right here and now if the church is more the church, and not like what you're saying, Jim. The church is the world just poured out, with the clothing of the church, right? And so then what though on a daily basis do I have to be mindful of so that I don't fall into these same things? Because that in-betweenness has got to be one of the most difficult places to be as a Christian. And yet that's where Jesus lived. He lived in the in-between eternity and temporality, in between thy will be done in heaven and what is being done here on earth, that in-betweenness. And so we need to be the spark. We need to be the picture. We need to be the full pouring out of love. But that means we need to first define love. And so like you were saying, Jim, we have this image in front of us. We have this truth in front of us, this relational truth called the Trinity. And if we step further into it, though, there's this love that just calls me to think and to act in ways that I don't want to. It stretches me. There's never a time where Jesus balked at going and doing what he was called to do with the living out the evangelical aspect, right? He was an evangelical, euangelion, the good news. He was all about the good news, but his willingness to, whatever case might be, right? Each one of us is called in to pick up our cross, and that looks different. So for me to project onto Phil, or Phil to project onto Jim, or Jim to project onto Kayla, what that must look like is, I guess you could almost say it borders on sin, right? Because then it's our will as opposed to God's will. How do I do that though, in a level though that's loving? Because the people in front of me, and Kayla's, we've been working through this like with university students, and before she graduated, there are a lot of views of Jesus that are just seemingly unbiblical, but it's about Jesus, and they throw in love. And so how do you engage that within the evangelical world, even before going to folks who are antagonistic or just don't care about Jesus? How do we engage that within our own realm of religion, where there's just these multiple views? Because there's plenty of churches in our area who are willingly saying, hey, if you need a letter, or if you need something to be anti-vax, anti-mask, we will be your refuge. And I'm like, is that the refuge that Jesus is talking about? That the church is supposed to be the refuge for that? So how is it that we engage other Christians though, who believe that they are of the way, and they are of the truth, and they are of the Jesus of the Bible?
Yeah. I wonder if talking about, we talk about love, and so I think we're all capable of it to a certain extent. I mean, if we were to say, okay, and so then, sometimes it's hard to apply it maybe to people, but I mean, the bottom line, what Jesus did was he demonstrated that everybody was deserving of love. I mean, he just kind of walked in that situation. I mean, he was self-giving. And so there is a certain amount of self-sacrifice on our part if we're going to be willing to love everybody, or if we're believing that everybody is deserving of love. And so that self-sacrifice might be our, whether it be political views, whether it be, I mean, all these things that are valuable, and and we hold so closely. But I mean, if we look at the other and just say, they are deserving of love, try to figure out how would I want to be loved in that situation?
Yeah, something I have to constantly remind myself when I'm interacting with really anyone, but honestly, it's almost easier for me to interact with someone on the corner of a street than to interact with some of these people in churches of wholesome, folsom. It's just, I have a hard time sometimes. And people say that phrase, wholesome, folsom, that's an actual thing. Yeah, that just gives you the vibe, of how it is. But I have to remind myself, they are image bearers of God just as much as I am. So if I think I am holier than thou, if I think, like these people are weird, these people are crazy, or like, I don't really care to even enter into conversation with you, because I don't really think that you'll even want to have dialogue, like that is me projecting onto them, and that's me shutting down any interaction before it even begins, and forgetting they bear the image of God just as much as I do. They're created in his image and made good and made beautiful. And so I should give them a chance. I should, seek to love them. And maybe that is in that moment not interacting for both of our sake. Maybe that is, just a passing wave, or maybe that's, hey, how are you doing? And when I ask that, I'm ready to sit down and actually listen to their answer and how they're doing, and not just be like, yep, good, cool, all right, and pass by, So we have to be willing to really step into what it means to be image bearers of Christ, and what that means when we interact with one another. I think that's probably the hardest part for me, is constantly reminding myself of that, but also stepping into that and saying, if we bear the image of Christ, what does that mean? And what does that mean inside and outside of the church, as people who proclaim, like, yes, I follow this Jesus guy. He is my savior. And this is the life that I lead. And in that, like, we are called to hold each other accountable, but in love, in loving ways. It doesn't look like walking up to people, pointing in their face and yelling at all the things that they're doing wrong. It probably looks more like the conversation, and starting with, how are you doing? What's going on? Because like you said, Phil, there are only a few aspects of people's lives that really differ to where we can end up exactly where they're at, for better or for worse, right? And I think that is also part of it. Like, we're all image bearers of Christ. Thus, we are not that different from one another. We all inherently have a lot of the same qualities. And when we sit with that, and when we get past, whatever feelings of, oh my gosh, I can't be that similar to her. Are you kidding me? Like, no. When we get past that, when we get over ourselves, then we can actually sit with people and react in love, and see them and have those conversations, whether they're, uncomfortable for us. I think that's when growth happens. I think that's when love happens. When we sit and we have to get over ourselves, we're able to be like, hey, how are you? And maybe that conversation's when we can call people out, call each other out, and be willing to be called out ourselves. And like, yeah, you know what? I probably shouldn't have said that, or I shouldn't have reacted in that way. I shouldn't have done this, or yeah, you know what? I need to do more of this. Thank you for seeing me, and for taking interest and investing in my life and where I'm at with Jesus, just as much as I'm investing in you. Thanks for noticing that. Thanks for saying something. Having that like change in perspective, it's really hard, but that's something that I'm working towards.
Yeah. I love that, what you're saying, Kayla, because earlier you were talking about, we're not called to defend God. We're not called to defend our faith. And sometimes I think we're not really defending God. We're defending us, right? I mean, we're defending our beliefs and all those things. And so I think I think you nailed it. But also what I'm hearing you say is, it's like the woman at the well, right? I mean, Jesus was kind of like the master of like changing up the subject. And so so then he has this theological discussion, and he realizes it's, for whatever reason, but then it gets personal, right? I mean, it gets personal about the person's life. And so, Kayla, I wonder if what maybe part of that, at least what I'm learning or I'm thinking through, is that instead of trying to defend, right? But what happens? I mean, how do we get past that, changing the subject to just saying, hey, how's your soul doing? I mean, I don't know about you, but this COVID thing, this mask, I mean, all this arguing has just beaten me down, and I feel discouraged. I mean, are you feeling discouraged? And maybe the commonness is to seek that commonness, right? I mean, one of the things is just the agony, the pain, the grief that we're going through, the lament, and maybe going from there and just connecting at that level instead of this surfacey talk, I mean, the way Jesus just kind of gets to the bottom of things, just changes that subject. But I think you're right, Kayla. I think it's, and you were talking about bridge building. You started by saying bridge building. And sometimes I wonder if we're more about defending our bridge, right? I mean, we want to make sure that we got to make sure this, but instead of defending the bridge is like, just how do we let people in? How do we let people in? How do we get to a point where, you know what, I completely disagree with them, but you know what, they can sit at my table, you know, because they're hurting. And again, maybe that's that way. This is how I can, this person is worth loving. And maybe when we do see that pain, instead of, these outside things. So yeah, I like that idea, is that discussion, Kayla, that you're talking about, is that, defending the bridge, or are we letting people in? Are we getting to the deeper things that really do matter? I mean, the things that Jesus touched about the soul, how are we doing? How are you doing? And even saying, being honest that, you know what, I'm not doing good. I'm having a really, really hard time with this, because, but really what I long for is just whatever. And so
because with that relational component comes the difficulty, and I think sometimes as Christians, we will throw out these things that sound awesome, love the sinner, but hate the sin, and it's very relational. We've talked about this, I just don't know the person in front of me. The reality is we talk within our Christian circles that they're not what they do. Because part of being human, we have attributed being human as, to sin is to be human. Shakespeare says to err is human, that's more along the biblical things as opposed to sin, because to say that to be human is to sin means that, you throw so much theological conundrums on there with Jesus, because then he wouldn't be fully human, right? And yet, even in that aspect of the sin is not the person, I myself find it hard to separate the person from their acts, because even what Jesus says, they'll know you by your fruit. He condemns the tree because it's lack of fruit, right? And it didn't produce. And so the tree was bound up with what it did not produce. And same thing with that, the woman at the well. You're right, Jim. He steps into it though. And instead of it being about her many husbands or this and that, it is about her soul. It's about her. And Jesus, all knowing, and knowing about the person in front of him, still embraces her and listens to her. It's I was talking with a dude, and he's talking about Jesus's interaction with people. I think it's from Mark 9 with the leader who's got the son who's been possessed, and he comes and asks Jesus for healing, and Jesus says, your son is healed. And at that moment that he said it, because the son wasn't there, he was healed. But before that, he sits down with the man and he listens. It says Jesus listened to him. And this is the thing, is that Jesus knew what was wrong. He knew a number of times we're told Jesus knows what's in their hearts, and yet he still asks them the question, what is it? The two brothers, what is it that you're contending about? Because when you, Kayla, you talked about this, when you actively listen, you have to be engaged with the person even before they're engaged with you. You have to be intentional. And I was talking with my mom, because this past week, she did take time out to go and spend time with my grandmother, and it was hard. And I was talking to her about what pastoral care is. This is why many are not called into pastoral care. I know we're all talk about ministers of reconciliation. We all have a ministerial part. But this is why when I get into church leadership, I am resolutely, there's not very many things that I'm like, I will hold to, but the calling into church leadership, the calling in, because Jim, Phil, Kayla, with their church, each one of us has church leadership. If you've been around people in church leadership who are just doing it for a job and it's not a calling, there is a distinct difference as to the way in which we embrace people, if it's our job, if we have to, as opposed to if I'm called into this ministry. There's not one time where Jesus pisses and moans about the people in front of him. He never once says these freaking people, right? What he says is, when he says it is, if you only knew how much I loved you, like a mother loves her, like a mother hen, like to gather up her chicks, like it's never in condemnation, it's never condemning them. It's never in judgment, like you're saying, Kayla, with that finger pointed and that you're a piece of, it's always like, oh my gosh, as the person. And I love those moments where the Spirit just convicts me, and he doesn't convict me of my sin. What he convicts me of is my lack of embracing the love that Jesus has for me. says, dude, why do you think you're such a big piece of, because you're not. Like, Jesus loves you so much. And I love those moments where I'm just brought to my knees and tears flow, only because I've neglected receiving this love that pours out from the cross. And I feel like if we, within the church, we're just honest with ourselves and says, yeah, you know what? The world can see it as weakness, but I am in need. And I'm in need of the other strength. And I need, you, Jim, to continue to tell me about your background. And I need you, Phil, to tell me about the work that you're doing here, because it's a form of embracing my soul. And like when I get coffee with Kayla and she tells me about some of the things that she's doing with her students and tutoring, and that feeds into me because it reminds me of the goodness that we are created in, and I feel like so often we push back against the community because we have to look at ourselves. In the world tells me, though, that I'm meant for the other. Of the world tells me the other is nothing more than a resource or a tool for me to utilize in order to get ahead, and I find that, like, Jim, you're talking, it seems like we know we all love. We know we're all capable of it. We know, because even the most staunch, aggressive person against God, they still know what it means to love someone in their lives, right? Love is that universal. What is it like for each one of you? Like for me, I don't know what it is that hinders me so much from loving and not loving the other, loving myself, receiving the love of God. Like, why is it that we have such a hard time with that?
Yeah, with receiving the love of God, I think it's in part we this is going to sound weird as I say it, but we don't believe the gospel. Like, we think we look at us and say, well, there's no way God would love this person. If he knew who I really was, he actually wouldn't love me. Well, yeah, that's kind of at the heart of the gospel. And I don't seem to be lovable. Yeah, God loves me. And that's part of why Jesus came and died on the cross, because yeah, we're not lovable, but he made us lovable, and that's becomes the crux of it. And so we want to give that same love to other people. And it's like, whoa, well, if I'm not lovable, then they're definitely not lovable either. So why do I want to share this same sacrificial love? But because I was made lovable, man, God makes them lovable too. And so we then have to show that same love to others. So yeah, there it is.
Yeah, I think it's hard to see our own worth. I think you nailed it, Phil. We don't really believe the Gospels. Do we really believe? Because it is uncomfortable when we sit there and have to sit with ourselves and really evaluate, like, can this God really, really love me? Like, he says he does, but do I believe that he loves me? Like, all my darkness, all my thoughts, he sees that, he knows me, and yet he still loves me. And I think that is probably one of the biggest struggles. And yet, if we don't constantly wrestle with that, then there's no way that we can go out and love others. There's no way that we can live and believe that they are image bearers of Christ, and they do deserve love, that they are loved. And that's our command, if we don't first start with ourselves. And that should be one of the things that we constantly, daily struggle with, that we wrestle with God and we're like, yeah, you know what? Like, you're right. But I need to work on believing that you're right.
Yeah, I would agree with Kayla. It's just that daily convincing. I mean, it's not like one of those things. The other thing too is it's so intangible. I mean, we can say, yeah, I felt loved when, at the birth of my child, or I felt love when I received this. But I mean, to say, you know what, somebody died for you just because, I mean, it's like, what? I mean, how does that, I guess it's like when Paul talked about love, when he says, well, we look in a mirror dimly, but really, I mean, part of it is, it is that act of faith. It is that act of faith to say, okay, and like Phil says, we doubt we don't understand the gospel fully, and so I guess maybe that we can only do as best as we can, but I think it's just we talk about it, being loved unconditionally, and we try to convince ourselves, but we've, at least for me, tangibly, I've never had somebody just say, hey, I will, maybe my parents come really close to it, but to think that somebody, in spite of, when I mess up or do something wrong, to think, wow, well, at least God still loves me. I mean, it's more like we're trying to convince ourselves when we say that, instead of really feeling that, he really, really does.
Yeah. It's like a story. This is the weird thing. And this is what I love about your preface, Phil. When you start talking about it, you say it sounds weird, because nothing about the Christian narrative, like when I pick up the Bible, seems normal to me, and yet we as Christians want to make it seem like this is the most normal thing ever, right? The raising of the dead, this dude who like talks to, trees, I mean, dude, when I was going to school at Davis, like people who talk to trees and hugging them and stuff, they were like out there in the fringe and all that, where Jesus would be all, hey, tree, good tree, okay, you tree, die tree, because it's like, so this stuff that he's doing, it is all bizarre. The most bizarre is, like you were saying, Jim, that, wait, unconditionally love me? And I feel, yeah, sometimes we continually talk it out because we're like, this can't be true. And I'm like, all these, when I sit back and go, I'm always concerned, wait, is this just God, a projection of my brain, someone I need him? And then I'm like, these millions of people though have these same kind of thoughts that we're all the four of us here questioning it is not something abnormal within the Christian world. I guarantee every Christian who ever has come across the face of the earth in the cross history has had these questions of like, there's no way this God can unconditionally love me, let alone all these people around us, and that to me in and of itself has to be some type of verdict, some type of evidence that gives us clear indication that there's something beyond the human, right? There's something, whether you want to name it God or Father, Son, Spirit, the fact is that we have a starting point. We all have a starting point, right? We all have this. And this is the point of New Wine, New Wineskins, is recognizing the similarities as well as the differences, so that in our diversity, we can see the beauty of our oneness. It's never a homogenizing to where you become nothing and you fade into this abyss of unknownness. In fact, it's the quite opposite. It is the embrace of your individualness so as to then grow into the beautiful mosaic of the community. And this is the continued dialogue. We're going to be uploading the video that went from Wednesday's, the community developments. And so we highly suggest that and encourage folks to go and watch that. Next week on New Wine Uncorked, we'll continue this discussion on what does it mean to be the community of believers who are wrapped in this euangelion, this good news. On Tuesday, so we have other platforms for those of you that follow us on YouTube and Facebook. We've been starting this new platform called Clubhouse, which is a mobile app. And on there you have in-room discussions. And so it's not video, it's like a conference, it's like a podcast, but then it's interactive podcasting. So check out Clubhouse. And on Tuesday mornings, New Wine has a group that gets together for this discussions. And so you can put it on and you listen in. And this Tuesday, we're going to continue the discussion on the community economic development that started with the seminar on Wednesday. What does it mean for the Christian to be involved in community economics? When you talk about money, we start to get into that weird, you start talking about community and money, people hear socialism and communism and oneness, and we share, whoa, is it biblical? What is the biblical precepts? And it goes right along with this. What does it mean to love the other holistically? The Good Samaritan loved the other. How did they? We often think about service, but the Good Samaritan loved by putting out an exceptional amount of money. Didn't even care. Didn't even ask how much it cost, right? It was just to take care of the fee. So what does that mean? So if you're interested in that, go to Clubhouse and then look up New Wine, New Wineskins, and download it. And if you have any questions or anything, just email newwine at gmail.com. And I'll put the email up there on our YouTube so that you can be involved in the ongoing discussions that we have at New Wine. And of course, every Friday, 10 a.m., tell your friends, because you won't find three better minds here between Jim, Phil, and Kayla. And I'm just along for the ride, and I totally appreciate it. But engaging this, and we want just the real tangible, because like Jim's saying, this divine love sometimes seems so intangible, but that's the problem with me. right? Because the more tangible I am in loving you, the more tangible this divine love becomes. And so we're so stoked that you joined us this Friday. We look forward to next Friday. Look at all the opportunities right underneath the YouTube description right there. Go right on there, hit subscribe, and right when you hit that, right next to it will be a bell. And then if you ding the bell, click the bell and highlight it, then anytime a video comes up or anytime we go live on YouTube, you will be notified. And that way you can participate with New Wine in our seeking out and our hope to build relational bridges in contemporary culture through Jesus Christ. So again, on behalf of Jim and Phil and Kayla, I'm Matt, and this has been another episode of New Wine Uncorked. Until next Friday, we'll see you on the flip side. Have a good one.